Okay. Okay, we'll start over. Thank you, Terry, for that wonderful sermon this morning. It really helped set the stage for a little bit of the history of Earth Day. And I want to thank you also for the invitation to give me the opportunity to reminisce a bit about what happened 52 years ago. It is very much a personal journey, probably defined the purpose of my life. So I'm going to start with that. I was raised by a single mom who was an incredible lady. She was a college professor. She was a college coach. She traveled the world. She ended up being a first lieutenant, United States Army during World War II. And that's where she met my father, who was one of her patients. She had me when I was 40 years old, when she came back from the war. And she was also the... Oh, she was 40 years old. Didn't I say that? Yeah, I was born 40 years old. She ended up being the head of the physical therapy department at the Veterans Administration in Sioux Falls, which was a large regional hospital. And one of the benefits of that was she was able to travel every summer for a month. And she had an old 52 Chevy. She cut the back seat out of it, and we went camping every summer until high school, when I was too big to fit in the back of the car. But we traveled to all 48 states, Mexico and Canada twice before I was out of high school. I think we probably camped in every national park that existed in 1946 to about 1956. So very much an influence in my life in terms of my appreciation and my love for the environment. When I went to law school in Washington, D.C., 1969, I started there, and it was a time when the environmental issue was really in its nascent stage. And everybody politically wanted to be the leader of the environmental movement. In fact, if you recall, Richard Nixon was the president, wanted to be known as the environmental president. And it was a time when I had some time in my first year of law school to volunteer. So I went to my U.S. Senator from South Dakota, George McGovern, probably one of the very few Democrats from South Dakota ever elected. And George let me work in his office. He gave me a choice, though. He said, you can either work on environmental issues or prison reform. Well, it wasn't a hard choice for me. I decided that the environment was something that I wanted to do. So I want to give you just a very thumbnail sketch of what was going on in 1969. First of all, one of the big events was the Santa Barbara oil spill. And the Santa Barbara oil spill spilled all over the area, 4.2 million gallons of oil over 10 days. Killed thousands of birds, killed lots of marine mammals, porpoise and sea lions and sea otters, all of the ecosystem around Santa Barbara. And as you can see, it was a pretty big area. Here is sort of Santa Barbara, LA. It was quite an event. It made a lot of news, as you might imagine. Also in 1969, we had the famous Cuyahoga River fire in Ohio, which that river was so contaminated with oil and gas, it caught on fire. And it brought out all kinds of firefighting equipment to extinguish the fire. Then 1966, a little few years before that, New York City experienced an air pollution episode, which literally killed 168 people and put thousands of people in the hospital who had already had breathing problems. And this wasn't anything new. In 1948, Donora, Pennsylvania, we had also an inversion there that killed about 16 or 20 people and sent thousands to the hospital. So it wasn't an event that was unexpected, I guess. In fact, in the Los Angeles area at that time, there was so much air pollution that it was equivalent to smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day. That's how bad it was. Then we had a wonderful idea, some did, to build this major jet port in the Everglades, which would have been 5 times the size of JFK Airport today. It would have had a 1,000-foot wide highway that ran from one side of Florida to the other in the middle of the Everglades. Fortunately, there was an environmental report that was done, came out and said it would have been a disaster, and it was stopped, even though there is still a small airport in the Everglades today. So, in my first year of law school, I became very conscious of what was going on. I might also imagine or mention that we had something called Vietnam War that was in progress at the time. So there was a lot of student unrest, and some of it began to develop for the environmental movement. So I created the Environmental Law Society at George Washington, which later became the National Environmental Law Society when we brought in students from Harvard and Stanford and some of the Minnesota from the other schools. And it was the first time we started talking about how our law could do something to try to help the environment. I created a group called Environment Exclamation Point, hence my button. And it was an opportunity to create an organization with some of my other fellow law students that could do some projects in the Denver metro, or in the DC metro area. The first thing we did is we created a community ecology center. We rented an old building in Georgetown and filled it with environmental educational materials and tried to get young people to come and learn about the challenges that we had. I did a project for the National Wildlife Federation, hired me to bring together what at the time were the old line conservation leaders of the country, from the Conservation Foundation, the Isaac Walton League, the Audubon Society, the Sierra Club, all of which were large conservation organizations that were doing conservation, but not environmental things, because that was a new idea. In fact, it was interesting, the word environment, for many, was as mysterious as the word sustainability is today. It was something that many people didn't really define. So we brought together these, I have to admit, old white men leaders of these conservation organizations with a lot of the young law students. And we spent 3 days talking about what our common ground was and how we could work together. I also had an opportunity to intern with the first President's Council on Environmental Quality. I ended up working for the man on your far right, Bob Kahn, who was a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer for the Christian Science Monitor. And I worked for a summer with the Council on Environmental Quality. And in that time, we produced the first Ceq Annual Report. And I even brought a copy along to show you. I was so proud even though I was an intern, they engraved my name on the cover of this first report. And then finally, I also was invited at that time to testify before one of the congressional committees. This happens to be the Committee on Government Operations. And it was a hearing held on April 3rd, a couple of weeks before the first Earth Day, an opportunity for citizens to come and talk about what they thought needed to be changed in the environment. So this is one of my sentences I pulled out, which I know that Blake will appreciate. You know, what then was what we call the malignant infection, which was our set of values that reflect negligent disregard for the environment. The better life is not controllable through economic gain, political prestige, or more plastic cups, or faster automobiles, or SSTs, the supersonic transports that were being proposed at the time, but rather population control, recyclable materials and products, and man living in harmony with his fellow man and nature. And finally, I argued that what Congress needed to do was to allow class action lawsuits by citizens for environmental damages that were caused by industrial government and private corporations. And there were literally 50 or 60 people who testified at these 2 or 3 day hearings about what was happening with the environmental decade. One of the stories that was my favorite was as we were preparing for the first environmental Earth Day, we had a group of high school students who wanted to enter these floats into the Cherry Blossom Parade. So you need to know the Cherry Blossom Parade is very much a commercial advertisement for businesses in the DC area. And so they did a float, had 3 parts to it. It was a parody of biblical sayings. So the first float was a quote from Genesis and showed Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and what had been created. And the second float showed man and woman despoiling the environment, polluting the waters and polluting the air. And then the third float was a quote from Exodus showing this absolute desert, nothing living, one stick sticking up, and that was all that was left. Well, the Cherry Blossom Parade Committee reviewed the float and decided it was not eligible because it made a political statement. But on account of that, the Washington Post took a picture of the float and put it on the front page of the Washington Post, which gave it more prestige than anything else. So Senator Gaylord Nelson from Wisconsin, Bob, was of course one of the people who was the founder of Earth Day. And this is a quote that he told DU students in 1970. He said, "The environment is rats in the ghetto, is hungry children in a land of affluence. It's a public housing that's not worthy of its name. It's a problem whose existence is perpetuated by the expenditure of $25 billion a year on the war in Vietnam, instead of our decaying, crowded, congested, polluted urban areas that are inhumane traps for millions of people." And I remember that somebody had done a scientific experiment where they had taken a box that was 6 feet by 6 feet, 6 feet high, and they put 2 rats into it. And they gave them enough food for those 2 rats. And of course, the rats multiplied and multiplied and multiplied to the point where they were in starvation and started eating their young. And this was sort of the, if you will, what they expected US to happen. And you may recall population control, population growth was a big issue. Paul Ehrlich had written a book called The Population Bomb. And in fact, Rockefeller created a committee. It was called the Rockefeller Population Control Committee that looked at what we could do in the United States to control population. One of the things that Senator Nelson asked for was a national teach-in day. He thought we needed something in the country that would teach people about what we were facing in the environmental arena. So I won't read these, but I'll let you take a look. These were some of the Doomsday Quotes that occurred at the time. Rather than notable people, the bottom, Paul Ehrlich. We also had Barry Commoner, who was from the Washington University, a biologist. Another one from the New York Times editorial, Kenneth Watt, who was an ecologist. So this was the mood of the country in 1970, very much raising the concerns of what would happen if we didn't start doing something to control our environment. So Earth Day 1970 came about, April 22nd, and Dennis Hayes and I both interviewed with Senator Gaylord Nelson to head up the national effort. I have to admit the better man won, but Dennis was nice enough to say, well, you can run Earth Day activities in Washington, D.C., our nation's capital. So we put together our effort, and this is one of Dennis's quotes saying that it's already too late to avoid mass starvation. Again, a kind of comment about what the situation was. And a student teach-in was the whole concept of Earth Day, that it would happen everywhere in the country and we would have a chance to talk about these environmental problems. So I started doing some fundraising activities. That's in my younger days. I still wish I had that beard, but I don't anymore. And we put together and we made a poster. I'm sorry. This is the poster we made, and we sold those for $1 a piece to try to raise money for our Earth Day activities. We also did the button as another way of raising money. And there's another button. So we did a number of things just to get people to contribute to our effort. We also wrote this Planet Earth, which was a Declaration of Independence for all species. I sat down last night and tried to read it. Very hard to read, but it had some interesting provisions. We said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all species have evolved with equal and inalienable rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And to ensure those rights, nature has instituted certain principles for the sustenance of all species, deriving them from the planet's life support system. And it goes on, and it talks about the problems that we were facing at the time. And then I got Senator Gaylord Nelson and Senator McGovern and Senator Pete McCloskey from California and Henry Royce from Wisconsin to all sign it as part of this proclamation for the planet. And we also use that to sell copies of that at our event. So what did we do? Well, we built a geodesic dome. We went to the Atomic Energy Commission in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, who had a dome and said, we'd like to rent this from you. And you can imagine a bunch of students coming in saying, we want to rent this dome. They said it would cost you $10,000, which was a lot of money in 1970. But we said, okay, and I can't remember how we guaranteed that we pay them, but I do know that they shipped it up to us, it landed on the mall, and we, with a bunch of students that we had, built this geodesic dome in the middle of the Washington Mall. We filled it with educational materials and with the things that we were trying to sell, and it became the center point, the headquarters of our Earth Day activities. So what has changed since 1970? Well, our population has doubled. We know that. We have a lot more people living on this spaceship Earth. CO2, one of the greenhouse gases, has increased over 2.5 times to raise the Earth's temperature by 1 degree centigrade. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but it's pretty substantial. It's the highest, as Terry mentioned in her sermon this morning, in terms of what we've experienced in the history of this Earth. 13% of our sea ice has melted, raising sea levels 5 to 6 inches. Again, that doesn't sound like very much. But if you look at what it's created, a situation where we have endangered lots of species who live in the solar areas. I don't know where I can stand. If you were to look at a map of sea level rise by the end of the century, you can see that 90% of the population of this country lives on the coasts. And all of those areas would be inundated. Already, we've heard stories about some of the coastal cities planning to build barriers to keep the seawater out as an idea for how do we adapt to this kind of a change. My daughter this morning just left to go to Dubai and the Maldives, the Republic of the Maldives, which is a atoll chain of islands off the southern coast of India. The average elevation of those islands is 4 feet. They will be totally gone if we don't do something about what's going on in terms of the heating of the Earth. We've lost 1/5 of the Brazilian Amazon rainforest. That is probably the biggest CO2 sink on Earth. And we are, again, 20% of that has been lost simply by agricultural interests and development interests. 900 animal species have been declared extinct, and thousands have been listed already on the Endangered Species Act. Earth Day 1970, what happened? What has occurred since then that's made any kind of difference? Well, for one thing, 20 million Americans participated in the first national teach-in, over 2,000 universities and communities, and 10,000 primary schools in 1970. And these are some of the laws that came about in the early 70s. The most important was the National Environmental Policy Act, which was the first time we ever had a national policy to deal with a major issue. We've been trying to get a national energy policy for the last 50 years. We had one in 1970 for the environment. But we also had all these other things that happened. We created the Environmental Protection Agency, which was done by executive order by Richard Nixon. We added the Endangered Species Act, which we updated as a federal law. Occupational safety and health, toxic substances, Superfund, which is to deal with the cleanup of all of our contaminated sites. The Marine Mammal Protection Act, the National Education Act, all of these, and there are many more. In fact, there's probably 10 pages of lesser environmental things that were done during the 70s, primarily in the first 5 years of the 1970s. Earth Day 1990 went global for the first time with 1 billion people participating in 141 countries. So it is something that we're still seeing happening today. So these are just some of the environmental gains. I have to talk about some of the positive things as well as the negative things. But clearly automobile emissions have decreased by 40% because of the standards that we have now for the automobile industry. Industrial air pollution has decreased by 90%. Water pollution has significantly declined. Rivers like the Potomac and the Charles River outside of Boston and the Cuyahoga River are now swimmable, which is a big accomplishment. Thousands of toxic chemical sites have been cleaned. Toxic PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, which are in batteries, large batteries and electrical systems that are highly toxic, have been reduced by 7,000%. Energy generation's fast moving towards renewables. Community awareness has improved significantly. And we now have signed and rejoined the Paris Climate Accord. You may remember our last president felt that this was nothing but somebody's pipe dream about this problem and took us out of the Paris Accord. And of course, President Biden has put us back into it. And it is hopefully bringing together the world to realize that. And in fact, US and China, China and US, the two largest polluters of greenhouse gas emissions, have been signed into this and are taking significant steps now. We also want to mention that in 1972, at the Copenhagen UN meeting on human development, we, the members there, adopted these UNEP Sustainability Development Goals. And I've circled those that all deal with environmental issues. So now we have an official, if you will, organization that is trying to do something with meeting the same kinds of goals that we have, including climate change, Goal 13. So just for fun, I threw this in. In 1990, which was the 20th anniversary of Earth Day, I was working as an environmental lawyer at one of the large firms. And somebody heard that I'd been involved in Earth Day, so they wanted to come and do a story and take a picture. And they titled it, "Old Radical Gone Corporate." I didn't know whether to take that as a compliment or a cheap shot. But in any case, they talked about a little bit about what we had done in the environment between 1970 and 1990. And then just 5 years ago, while Trump was systematically dematerializing our environmental laws and programs, I wrote this editorial for the Denver Post saying basically we need to resurrect Earth Day. We need to find a way to come back to the principles and the ideals that we had. So I want to tell you just a brief story, and this is the last thing I have, about a man named Ray Anderson. Ray was the CEO of, as you see, of the Interface Carpet Company. The Interface Carpet Company was a typical carpet company in the late 90s, and his customers and his employees came to him and said, "Ray, what are you doing for the environment?" And he was confounded because he didn't know what he was doing. His company wasn't doing anything. So he read a book called The Ecology of Commerce, which was written by Paul Hawken. And in that book, Paul Hawken argued that much of our pollution today was caused from industrial sources. And it was up to the industrial leaders of our country to do something about it. Well, this became for him a realization that he could do something with his own company. So we have a film that's been done by a colleague of mine. It's called Beyond Zero, that tells this entire story, but I'll try to summarize it. He first of all went to his chief financial officer and his chief operations officer, and he says, "We're going to make this company an environmentally sustainable company." And they kind of looked at him and said, "I don't know what you mean by that." And he said, we're going to find a way to make this company not only financially productive, but also to do something for the environment. So if you recall, back in the 90s, most of our carpet was laid to cover an entire room. When you think about it, what wears out? Well, it's the path that you walk in, which is usually 15 to 20% of the carpet. So when that wears out, you have to replace the whole carpet system. So the first innovative thing he did is he created what are tile squares, or modular tiles. And if you go to any major public building today, including the University of Denver, the tiles are modular tiles like these tiles on the floor. And so when a path wears out, all you do is replace those particular tiles. The second thing he did is he found a way to recycle the old tiles and turn them back into material that could be recycled to create new tiles, and they did that. And the third thing he did was he wanted to get rid of the very toxic glues that they used to put tiles down. And so they discovered a way in which they actually went back and they used a concept called biomimicry. Biomimicry means an imitation of the way nature does things. And of course, gravity is one of those parts of it. So they had figured a way to lay those tiles down with a simple little adhesive strip that they could put down and put the tiles on it. And the weight of the tiles held down the entire floor. And it was a wonderful way to get rid of the toxic materials. And then finally, one other thing he did, which I think is really innovative, he said, we're not going to just sell tiles. We are going to provide the option for people to rent their floor coverings. We're going to make it a service. And in so doing, we'll take care of the tiles. They don't have to worry about it. We'll clean them, we'll replace them when they're needed. And so he turned a product into a service. And it's interesting how other companies have picked up on that now. Otis Elevator no longer sells elevators. They sell lift services. And they take care of the equipment. And when it runs out, when it gets old, they take it and recycle the parts. So it was a wonderful concept. Ray Anderson, unfortunately, first of all, I should say by 2010, he looked back and they had made their company profitable. They were at net zero when it came to emissions, and they wanted to go beyond that. It wasn't enough. So he found a new CEO to run the company. He retired. He had a form of cancer. He died in 2011, but his legacy was carried on in the company. And he became, before that time, chairman of the President's Sustainability Council, among other things. He has dozens of awards. He was given 20 PhD honorary degrees. Incredible guy. And the last thing I want to mention is that he had a friend of his that talked to him about what was going on and wrote a poem for him. And the poem's called Tomorrow's Child. And it goes like this. Without a name, an unseen face, knowing not your time and place, tomorrow's child, though yet unborn, I met you first last Tuesday morn. A wise friend introduced us to, and through his sobering point of view, I saw a day that you would see, but not for me. Knowing you has changed my thinking, for I never had an inkling that the things I do might somewhere, somehow threaten you. Tomorrow's child, my daughter's son, I'm afraid I've only just begun to think of you and of your good, though always knowing that I should. Begin I will to worry about the waste that I have created. For someday, sometime, near I forget that you will come to live here too. Wonderful poem. So can I answer any questions? Bill.
I was surprised that the EPA was, initiated by executive order. I assume it's been formalized by legislation.
No, it was actually part of what they called reorganization number 3, which was a legislative reorganization, but it was by executive order that Nixon actually created that initially. Although he opposed it at the beginning.
And he appointed my cousin John Quarles as the
Yeah. Oh, gosh. Yeah, the question is, what can we do in our own neighborhoods to deal with the environment? Well, I wish I had a list of things. I did one time a list of things that could be done, but there are things like simply recycling materials, finding ways to insulate our homes better. Energy use is one of the biggest problems we have in terms of having to find that energy now still with coal-fired power plants, although they are now being replaced with renewable energy. Finding ways to save water. We're in the process of looking at getting rid of our grass in our front yard because it takes up so much water. I don't know. Not a lot of those things come to mind right now, but I think the things that Terry talked about in her eco-justice group are ideas I'm sure that'll come out of what things can be done. Bob?
Bill McCarron suggested to us at the annual meeting that we replace that south lawn with xeric landscaping and quit watering. And, you know, now's the time we should do it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, I don't know how many of you have been reading articles about the health of the Colorado River, but it is in really sad shape, and there's likelihood that we won't be able to generate any kind of electricity in the next decade, not 50 years, but in the next 10 years if the Colorado River continues. And we've had these drought conditions, and as many of you probably know, the Colorado River Compact, which was signed in 1926, was at a time when the water levels of the Colorado River were historically high. So the allocation of that water to the many states was way out of balance with what actually occurs there.
One of the things that I heard this morning was, you know, that we can, by planting trees, we can lower the Earth's temperature. And so that's encouraging that we're planting a tree today.
Yes.
But I also wonder what you think of, so the Biden passed or signed a order on Friday, well, this last week, I'm not sure what day it was, to inventory our trees, our forests. And having worked in the early 1970s for a man who was doing some of that sort of work in the Black Hills, I find that intriguing that we're finally going back 50 some years later to doing that. So what do you think that, I mean, do you think that that's impactful?
Oh, yes, I do. I mean, if you look at the history of this country, our country was 90% growth of trees and other kinds of vegetation when we first landed here. Even though the Native Americans were taking care of it, we decided to cut it all down. So I think we have like 10 or 15% of the area now is still forest areas and trees, largely managed by the federal government now. And so I do think that there are things that are being done, although we need to recognize, and some of the big lumber companies and paper companies have been planting 2 trees for every one they cut down. But the problem is they're cutting down the old growth trees, and those are the ones that have the most capability to absorb CO2 from the atmosphere. So the young trees are going to be 20, 30 years before they really become significant sinks for CO2.
Skip, the best read right now for us, a book or an article?
Well, there's 2 books. Obviously, The Ecology of Commerce by Paul Hawken is a great book. And Paul Hawken teamed with Amory Lovins, and they wrote a book called what's it called? Natural Capitalism. Natural Capitalism. And basically it's a book about how business and how business can use strategies to improve the environment and still be a viable company in terms of making a profit for its shareholders and doing things for the community. So those are probably in my mind. Now there are lots of books. There's another book by Bill McDonough called Cradle to Cradle, which is a book about recycling and what can be done with that. I don't know, if you really...
It's so good. Oh, I have have a question. So speaking of capitalism and businesses, what is the effect of divesting from fossil fuels at like small scale, like individually in our, retirement accounts, but also as a I was there when the UCC decided to divest from fossil fuels. So what is the impact of making that kind of decision?
Well, one of my favorite quotes came from Governor Richard Lamb, who of course was one of our great environmental governors here. And he said, "No snowflake will take responsibility for an avalanche." And this idea that it really does take a group effort to make a difference. But yet, when you do it and I do it and your neighbor does it, people start seeing the advantages of it. We put solar on our house 10 years ago, and then we've reduced our our electric bill by 80%. I mean, just things like that we can do. I think the fossil energy industry is going to die. It may not totally go away, but I don't think, it's going to be a very minor. If you look at the trend lines now for fossil energy, they're on their way down while renewable energy is going up. And we do know things like wind energy and even PV, photovoltaic energy, is now competitive price-wise with coal for sure, and getting close to being competitive with oil and gas, particularly if the prices continue to rise. And you may know, Xcel has a wind program where you can choose to take energy just from their wind source, and it costs you a few pennies more, but it's another idea of how do we become used to dealing and depending on renewable energy. After all, the sun is the most important nuclear energy we have. Yeah, Ray?
Solar energy too, just a plus.
If anyone wants to take a look, I'm happy to put together. Yeah, hello? Oh, hello?
Hello.
Yeah, it's been a very controversial thing that you first brought up was about, you called it population control, and that's really been a hot topic for decades. There are people who have brought up this topic and they've totally been chastised, mainly by religion. Do you see where this is at now and maybe where it's going to maybe look at population management, education?
Well, we do know today that educated populations have fewer children. And so in third world countries where it's principally the problem, or the developing countries, the more educated they come, the more likely it is to reduce the number of children in the family. I don't think we're going to see the kind of movement that was proposed back in the 1970s, just for the reasons that you cited, Ray. It's too controversial, and Lord knows we don't need another issue to divide this country. So I don't see anything in the short or midterm that's going to make a difference, except that actually the rate of change in the U.S. population has declined. Not the total number, but the rate of change has. And we're seeing that in other developed countries as well, as they become more cognizant of the limited resources they have to support a larger population. Eileen? Last question, maybe?
So in terms of the United States, it's my understanding without immigration, we are at zero population growth or even declining growth. But what's interesting is to hear the economists all upset about it because economic things work better for with a growing population. Can you address any of that?
No.
I mean, in fact, they're using it to encourage us
Yeah.
to bring in more people in the country from immigrants.
Well, I think that's coming primarily from the agricultural sector. It wants the cheap labor they've always gotten from the Mexicans and the Asians who've come into this country. I think that's still a big political issue as to how we deal with those kinds of immigration issues. So I'm really not very well versed in that, Eileen, so I can't tell you except to be aware of the fact that there are people that are pushing for us to take more people into the country. So, well, again, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure for me. So. Great.
was so good.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure. Thank you, Ray. I gotta put my mask back on here, I guess. I got a runny nose today for some reason.